Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. It's been just days after the US has captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in a dramatic special forces operation. The focus now is shifting from how it happened to what it all means. What does it mean for Venezuela, for US power, and for a world already on edge? So the move has drawn international criticism and has also reopened old questions about US intervention in regime change. So let's discuss this further. Joining me on the line is James M. Dorsey, who is an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He's also an author and host of the Turbulent World podcast and syndicated column. James, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. Now, we've had a few days to process the capture of Maduro. I'm just wondering, for you, how have you been thinking about this moment in history? What does it represent to you, particularly about how the US sees itself currently?
Sorry. First of all, we're in a situation in which we have more questions than we have answers. Having said that, I think what's evident is that whatever happens, this is a paradigm shift. And it's a paradigm shift not necessarily only for the United States and not necessarily only for Latin America. Clearly, this is the United States establishing, and to be fair to President Trump, he's honest about it, in contradiction to his predecessors, who mostly cloaked this kind of operation in promotion of democracy, promotion of human rights. Trump says it straight out. This is about dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And we'll have to see how this all unfolds, whether or not this is a relatively peaceful, relatively efficient transition process, or whether or not this is going to be very tumultuous and destabilizing.
Right.
Whatever, if I may, just whatever happens in Venezuela, the question is, or for that matter in Colombia, if Trump were to proceed with his threats, there is nothing that stops Russian President Vladimir Putin from attempting to apprehend Vladimir Zelensky on charges that he is a Nazi, or Xi Jinping to apprehend the leader of Taiwan on the assertion that the leader is a secessionist. So this sets a precedent that potentially goes beyond the United States and its sphere of influence, if you wish.
So are you saying that this move is likely to be seen as a kind of a green light for other world leaders, particularly those who have, who are at odds with other countries?
I'm saying that potentially is the case. You could see, and Israel has done this in the past, Israel kidnapping Hamas leaders in various countries. Now, it's done that in the past with other people, including going far back as the 1960s with Adolf Eichmann, who was sort of the godfather of the gas chambers of the Nazi regime. So what it potentially reestablishes that precedent, if you wish.
Are we no longer in the era of international law and global order? Is that just now a mere suggestion in this age of incursions into other countries and kidnapping and capturing world leaders and bringing them back to your own country to be tried and tested under charges?
You can question whether we ever were truly in the era of rule of law, but what certainly is the case, and many people would argue that you've had a total breakdown of the rule of law, starting with the Gaza war. if not already with the Russian incursion into Ukraine in 2014 and the 2022 full-fledged attack on Ukraine.
Right. James, talk to me a little bit about what history has taught us when we look at U.S. involvement in regime changes elsewhere in the past. If you look at Iraq, at Libya, at Afghanistan, and taking into account what President Donald Trump has said about managing this transition, about effectively running the country in this transition, where have you seen those assumptions that the U.S. can effectively manage a transition collapse? What can we learn from U.S. involvement in the past?
I think you could argue that the overwhelming majority of U.S. military interventions aimed at regime change have failed. They certainly failed in Afghanistan. They certainly failed in Somalia. To some degree at a very high cost, but nevertheless, Iraq is not necessarily a failure. And what in many ways was a success was the 1989 intervention in Panama, which is the intervention with which Venezuela is most compared to. Now, the fact of the matter is Venezuela is not Panama. And there were good reasons why it succeeded in Panama, all reasons that don't exist in Venezuela.
Right. So then talk to me a little bit about what this means. What typically goes wrong when a leader is removed? So in this case, you have the president and his wife being removed, but the system is still in place. So what typically goes wrong first once the leader is removed?
Well, first of all, look, in Venezuela, the jury is out. Clearly the strategy is to take out Maduro and his wife and keep the regime in place, in the belief that you have enough leverage, enough coercion, enough intimidation to force the regime in place to comply with your demands and your policies. Whether that's the case in Venezuela remains to be seen. There are indications that may be the case. You've seen much more moderate language by Delcy Rodriguez after her swearing in. There are reports that a deal with her was cut prior to the U.S. apprehension of Maduro. So it's not a given that Venezuela will be a failure. It's definitely a significant risk. What you need is, of course, and that's what you had in Panama. So if you look at Panama, the United States invaded. On the night of that invasion, the post-Noriega president was sworn in on an American military base, but was sworn in. You had troops on the ground. Those troops on the ground were there prior to the invasion, not because of the invasion, but because Panama hosted the U.S. Southern Command at the time. So you had in place a transition government of your choice, and you had the troops on the ground. You don't have that in Venezuela. And again, the calculation on Trump's part is that he doesn't need them, that this regime will fall into place. And the fact that you've established facts with the apprehension of Maduro and you have an armada off the coast will be sufficient to keep that regime in place. Time will tell.
Something you said at the start of the conversation, James, intrigued me. You said at least Trump's honest and not couching this under claims of upholding democracy. Donald Trump has said that U.S. oil companies could be moving into Venezuela. Talk to me a little bit about this honesty. What does it justify? What can we read into it?
Well, let me take a step back. First of all, I think that the intervention in Venezuela was about sending a message. First and foremost, to the region, but potentially beyond the region. Think of Iran. Trump has said that he would intervene if the regime in Tehran continues to kill protesters. So this was about sending a message. He's emphasized oil, and he has a sort of obsession with oil. What he hasn't emphasized is something else that Venezuela has, which is rare earth minerals and many other resources. The issue with oil is, keep in mind, none of the US major oil companies has said anything about this until now. They're not jumping. They're waiting to see. Fact of the matter is that it would take a tremendous investment. You know, estimates range from $35 to $60 billion to resurrect the Venezuelan oil industry. And it will take several years. So this is not something that's going to happen immediately. But there's one other aspect to all of this, and that is Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. What does that mean? That means that Venezuela has almost as much oil as the United States and Saudi Arabia combined. That is if you have leverage or control of that, that is a phenomenal position. It changes potentially the balance of power in the international oil market, which for decades, Saudi Arabia was the swing producer. It could lose that position. So oil has a lot of significance beyond the fact on how many barrels a day are you producing.
Okay, so where do we go from here? What are you going to be watching out closely for? You said at the beginning we have more questions than we do answers. What answers are you looking for the questions you have right now?
I think the most important question, really, or the most important thing to watch is, what does the regime in Caracas do? To what degree are they willing to cooperate? The acting interim president has said that she wants respect and balanced relations with the United States. She wants to work with the United States. We don't know what that means. For now, she has been able to keep the regime together. You've seen the military unite behind her. Is that going to be sustainable? To what degree is Trump going to be flexible to ensure that she can succeed on his more or less on his terms? So there are a lot of issues out there that one needs to watch.
It's interesting times indeed, James. Thank you so much for being on the show. James M. Dorsey there, and we'll be right back with more on the issue of the U.S. incursion into Venezuela and what happens next. Stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Let's continue our conversation about the fallout from the US's abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Joining me on the show now is Dr. Adrian Ang, who is a research fellow and coordinator of the US program at Nanyang Technological University's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Adrian, thanks so much for being on the show with me today. So, looking back at the events of the past few days, so Donald Trump has said that the US could run the country, quote unquote, until there is a proper transition in place. What do you think that suggests about Washington's endgame in Venezuela?
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for having me on. I think, right now it is vague as to what exactly the Trump administration's endgame is in Venezuela. So I think a lot of people were, at least the Venezuela exile community, I think, went from elation when they heard that Maduro had been renditioned, but then they sort of got disappointed when they heard that this was not regime change per se, since his vice president has now been sworn into office. So at least it appears that regime change is not on the immediate cards, and the Trump administration, I think, has also learned from past interventions that regime change and quote unquote nation building is not acceptable to large chunks of their bases. So right now, they are keeping it vague as to what is going to be the end game. The goal for the Rodriguez administration is that they want cooperation and they want oil to flow. So that has basically been the Trump administration's demands so far, And any talk about a transition to a different administration has been kicked down down the road.
Okay, so Donald Trump had mentioned U.S. oil companies could be looking into moving into Venezuela. Talk to me a little bit about how central energy and economic interests are here. How are you reading the factor of oil?
So the president has mentioned oil a lot, So the argument, that this is really a drug operation now has been put, aside, even as Maduro has been inducted in a court in New York. But the problem I see is there's a disjuncture between how President Trump views Venezuela and its oil resources and oil companies themselves, Because this comes at a time where oil prices are relatively low. And if we look at Venezuela's oil resources, even though it has the largest proven reserves in the world, Venezuela oil is of the heavy variety, It is not light sweet crude, so it needs a lot of refinement, before it can be used for aviation fuel, gasoline, for cars, etc. And when you add on top that Venezuela's oil infrastructure has been degraded over the last 20 years, after Hugo Chavez took over and nationalized Venezuela's oil industry. The oil industry in Venezuela requires large amounts of investment to get oil flowing again. So it is still unclear whether American oil companies will follow the president's lead, to invest in Venezuela's oil sector to get oil flowing again.
So that could be quite a large investment and could take some time. Adrian, you said a bit earlier, I'm curious to know about the domestic US perspective. There hasn't been a lot of appetite in the past few years about US intervention on foreign ground, given its history. So what political calculations do you think are at play here for Trump when he is thinking about the impact it might have on domestic politics?
So we have some sort of snapshot on that since Reuters has a poll over the weekend, and the results came out yesterday. And again, in America's polarized times, it is not surprising that Republicans overwhelmingly approve of what the president has done, and independents and Democrats do not. So I think if we just look at the Republicans and Trump's MAGA base, him being vague about what the end state is, and now at least certainly deferring from putting U.S. troops on the ground in Venezuela, doesn't alienate his America First base, who probably have very little appetite for nation building in Venezuela.
Okay, so what do you then see as the impact or the message that's being sent to other world leaders from this, from Trump's move? I mean, what could this mean for U.S. relations with Latin America more broadly?
So I think different countries are going to take the messages very differently. So sort of almost immediately after the rendition of Maduro, sort of Trump already turned his attention, sort of threatening Colombia, He has also threatened Mexico to take care of cartels, sort of before we do something. So I think for Latin America, sort of broadly speaking, this was really an American flex of his. Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or what he has called sort of his Donroe Doctrine. So if you sort of follow social media, the White House, the Department of War has said, sort of this is our hemisphere. So this is a broad claim of America's prerogatives in its sphere of influence, the reviving of the Monroe Doctrine. So other countries, and I think especially if you are Denmark, you really have to worry about what ambitions the administration has on Greenland. I think you have to take sort of those threats seriously. And of course, if we move closer to home, in Southeast Asia and the larger Indo-Pacific, I think this creates a problem for countries who want to uphold a rules-based international order, because nothing that the United States did with regard to Maduro and Venezuela, conforms to a rules-based order. So, sort of countries are going to be sort of hard pressed on the one hand to criticize the administration, because again, we're talking about an administration, that is, shall we put it, mercurial, and sort of it takes a lot of these things seriously, and we see that in sort of the statements that are put out by Southeast Asian countries and the foreign ministries, talking about expressing grave concern, asking sort of all parties to exercise restraint, without directly criticizing the United States.
Wow. The previous guest I interviewed in the segment before yours thought that this could send a message to Putin and to Xi Jinping that they too could maybe, justify similar actions in countries they may not, towards global leaders they may not be so favorable, they might not have favorable relations with. So what do you think? Do you think it sets a precedent in that regard?
So it certainly might, sort of, at least with Putin, sort of this is more in keeping, sort of with his, sort of, philosophy or ideology, But I think if you're looking at China, and if Xi Jinping is looking at Taiwan, sort of, I don't think it works the same, because, sort of, China's position has always been that Taiwan is part of China. So this has really nothing even to do with international law. This is a domestic affair, sort of an unresolved issue of the Chinese Civil War. And sort of the PRC's calculations vis-a-vis Taiwan is really not about, sort of, whether there is a sphere of influence or an example granted by the US, but sort of if China thinks it has the military capabilities to conduct a contingency against Taiwan.
Right. Well, Adrian, it's still, a lot of things are still up in the air at the moment. The story is still developing, but what are you watching out for next that might tell you whether or not Trump's gambit succeeds or if it unravels?
So I think, we have to see what Trump does next with regard to the countries that he has openly named and threatened, to look at sort of what they are doing with Colombia, what they are doing with Mexico, Iran, and sort of obliquely also with Denmark and Greenland, and how sort of these states are responding.
Right. Okay, so I guess we'll have to see how this story develops. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, Dr. Adrian Ang there from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Wrapping up this episode of Consider This, I'm Melisa Idris, signing off the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.